Good evening, everybody. I'm Ed Epstein, president of the Lincoln Group of the District of Columbia. Welcome to our January 2025 monthly program. Tonight, we're going to hear from one of our members, Jeffrey Boutwell, as he discusses his new book just out called Boutwell, Radical Republican and Champion of Democracy. Jeff is you'd call it collateral descendant of George Boutwell. To introduce Jeffrey, I'd like to introduce our Lincoln Group Vice President of Programming, Dr. John Willen. John?
Thank you, Ed. Very happy to introduce Jeff. A lot of you already know him, but let's start by saying that Jeff is a writer, historian, and public policy specialist whose 40-plus year career spanned journalism, government, and international scientific research and cooperation. He has written widely on issues relating to nuclear weapons, arms control, European politics, Middle East security issues, and environmental degradation and civil conflict. He has a PhD in political science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a BA in history from Yale University. And he worked for many years at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Jeff grew up in Winchester and Concord, Mass, and now lives with his wife in Columbia, Maryland. He and George Boutwell actually share a common ancestor, the indentured servant James Boutwell, who immigrated from England to Salem, Massachusetts in 1632. In addition, in looking up Jeff's bio and so forth, there are several blurbs of endorsement of this book, in association with the book, including, and I thought I'd mention some of these people. One is Jonathan White, the other is Charles Calhoun, and the next two we just discussed, Ed Acorn, and our next speaker, Sidney Blumenthal. So these are all people who have actually given favorable reviews to Jeff's book. So without further ado, let me have Jeffrey Boutwell give his presentation.
Thank you, John. And thank you, Ed, and thank you, John O'Brien and Kelsey and everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. It's a real wonderful opportunity to be doing this tonight. I really appreciate it. As Ed said, I'm not going to take more than 30 minutes to go through this slide presentation. As I mentioned on Saturday when we had our book study group discussion on Ed Acorn, I want to give you a little background, little kind of career summary of George Boutwell, so that I will tell you why I think he's one of the most consequential American public figures in history, but also one that Americans have never heard of. I'll explain why they've never heard of him, some of the reasons that historians have dismissed and neglected him for so long, but also why he's now coming back into vogue. So I'll spend a little bit of time on George's career, just hitting the highlights. I won't go into any depth and the many very important policy issues that he was involved in. But then, halfway through the discussion, as I mentioned, I really want to go into what I consider to be a quite important event that linked George Boutwell and Abraham Lincoln that happened in August of 1862. So I'll spend a good 10 or 15 minutes on that. That'll wrap up the 30 minutes. And with this group especially, I'm really hoping for some great discussion, observations, questions regarding what I have to say about George Boutwell and Abraham Lincoln. So to start off, why do I think George is one of the most consequential political figures Americans have never heard of? Two main reasons. One, the longevity of his career, and second, the breadth and depth of the public policy issues that he was involved in. Longevity, 65 years in public life. He met his very first president in 1839, Martin Van Buren. He was 20 years old, traveling from Massachusetts to Washington, met Van Buren at the White House. The last time he got together with a president was 1904 with Teddy Roosevelt. That happened to be up in Groton, Massachusetts, George's hometown. Two of Teddy's sons were going to the exclusive Groton School, in Groton, Mass, and George and Teddy got together in 1904. So 65 years from his first president to his last one. In between, he knew almost every president, but most especially, he was a close ally and friend of both Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant. And I'll go into that a bit more in a minute. By the same token, he just, as much as he was a friend of Lincoln and Grant, he was an implacable foe and led the impeachment or helped to lead the impeachment process of Andrew Johnson in 1866, 67, and 68. He updated the U.S. legal code for Rutherford B. Hayes after Hayes became president. In the 1880s, he was offered cabinet positions by Chester A. Arthur, but declined them. And then in the 1890s, he became president of the Anti-Imperialist League following the Spanish-American War to oppose the annexation policies of both McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt. So a quite close association, involvement, working with, opposing, you name it, with presidents from Martin Van Buren up to Teddy Roosevelt. That's the longevity part. Next. More important is the breadth and depth of his career. George had the opportunity to become immersed and expert in essentially the three major areas of American public life. The first one I call domestic policy and civil rights. He cut his teeth in the 1840s as a representative in the Massachusetts House of Representatives for 7 terms in the 1840s, educating himself on education, health, labor, and railroad issues. He then becomes the youngest ever governor of Massachusetts in 1851, serves for 2 years in that position. In 1855, one of his real loves throughout his life was education, public education. He becomes secretary of the Massachusetts Board of Education in 1855. The very first secretary of that body had been Horace Mann back in the 1840s, known as the father of American public education. So George was continuing that tradition in the 1850s as secretary of the Mass Board of Education. That went up to 1860 when he became Lincoln's Commissioner of Revenue. But on the civil rights and domestic policy, he served 6 years in Congress, 1863 to 69, where he was very instrumental in framing and passing both the 14th and 15th Amendments. And then, of course, as a cabinet member of the U.S. Grant and in the U.S. Senate in the 1870s, he's a seminal figure during the Reconstruction period and enforcing the KKK Acts, enacting the Civil Rights Law of 1875, and other such aspects of civil rights policy. So from the 1840s all the way through the 1870s, George is intimately involved in domestic policy and civil rights. That's just one area. Second area is economic policy and finance. He began his education on those issues when in the Massachusetts House in the 1840s, but especially as governor of Massachusetts in the 1850s. With that experience, he was picked by Lincoln to become Revenue Commissioner in 1862 after Congress passed the Revenue Act of 1862 and instituted an income tax for the first time in American history. George served in that position from 1862 to 63 and really put the Revenue Office in good working order to raise needed funds for the Union War effort. And with that experience, in 1869, Ulysses Grant asks George to become his Treasury Secretary after the first person he asked, Alexander Stewart, fell through. Anyway, George served for 4 years as Grant's Secretary of the Treasury. And again, I think was quite important in retiring the Union Civil War debt that had lasted from the Civil War that had to be paid off if America was to establish, a solid economy and good trading relations with its European partners. George was an exemplary Secretary of the Treasury for 4 years. So that's his background in economic policy and finance. Finally, on foreign affairs, George had really not considered or involved himself in foreign affairs much until the 1870s. Actually, when he left the U.S. Senate, he did lose his reelection bid in 1876. But presidents and secretaries of state asked him to serve on important international commissions in the 1880s involving France, Haiti, and Chile. The Kingdom of Hawaii hired George as its legal counsel to represent it before Congress in the 1880s so that it could maintain its most favored tax status and have sugar come into this country duty-free. With that experience, George then opposed the annexation of Hawaii in the 1890s. And finally, most importantly, in 1898, and I think this really, it kind of sums up George's personality and his character and his Yankee attention to detail and his work ethic as much as anything. In 1898, at the age of 80 years old, George is asked to become president of the Anti-Imperialist League after the United States has won the Spanish-American War, but McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt make it clear that they want to annex the Philippines. They send thousands of American troops over to the Philippines, and a very diverse coalition comes together at that point to oppose that annexationist policy. It includes people like Andrew Carnegie from the corporate world, William James, the social philosopher, Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, representing the Black community, Samuel Gompers, representing labor. This diverse coalition comes together to be really the first mass movement, anti-war movement in American history. And George is asked to be president of it at the age of 80 years old, which he does for the next 7 years until he dies in 1905. He is still president when he dies of pneumonia in 1905. Anyway, that was his education in foreign affairs and extending again all the way back to the 1840s and going up to the early years of the 20th century. There aren't many American public figures have been as intimately involved in all three of those areas with important influences on those policies during that time. Next. So, if he's so consequential for over 65 years, why isn't George better known? Why have most Americans not ever heard of him? Why was he neglected and dismissed by American historians for so long? Can't go into great detail here, but there are two major reasons I'll mention. One is his personality. George was every bit the New England Yankee, stolid, not an attention seeker, modest in terms of staying in the background. I like to compare him to Charles Sumner, Thaddeus Stevens, and Ben Butler, all of whom were larger-than-life characters in Congress and in American government. And George was just a very different personality from all three of those characters. The Bit of a Scold is one of my favorite quotes. It comes from Fawn Brodie and her biography of Thaddeus Stevens in the 1950s, which I think is one of the finest biographies ever written of an American public figure. But she gets it right, I think, right on the button when she said, George, he could get testy. He could get his nose would turn up, and he could be quite dismissive of the talents of many of his colleagues. That comes through in his memoirs that he wrote at the end of his life. So he wasn't the warmest individual in his public sphere, but he was an effective conciliator and an effective team player when it came to forging public policy. But he just didn't have the personality that others of that period did. More important, though, than the personality was that George can be considered to have been on the losing side of four major episodes in American life. And I'll just go through these fairly quickly. The Johnson impeachment. He and Ben Butler and John Bingham and Thaddeus Stevens, who led the impeachment, all of whom were seen for many, many years as having engaged in an extra-legal attempt to oust a sitting president on the flimsiest of grounds. That thinking has changed over time, but for much of the 20th century, the radical Republicans who tried to impeach Andrew Johnson were seen to have just really gone off the deep end in impeaching a sitting president. Second is the Grant administration. Of course, Grant was, not highly thought of as a president for many, many decades. His drinking, his nepotism, his corruption, his inattention to what was going on around him. Ulysses Grant had a terrible reputation well into the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, fostered in part by elitist disdain of Henry Adams and people like that. But because George was a Grant ally and a important member of the Grant administration, he was guilty by association, and he suffered accordingly by the disdain that was levied at the Grant administration. Third, the anti-imperialist campaign was seen as a losing side of history. Here were some old fogies in the 1890s who were, opposing the dynamism of Teddy Roosevelt at the dawn of the American century. Teddy is taking America overseas and he's leading it into the 20th century. And you've got people like George and Andrew Carnegie and Mark Twain and Samuel Gompers, who are seen as kind of leftovers, holdovers from the 19th century and out of step with the times. So for many years, George suffered from being identified with the anti-imperialist campaign, but of course, with American military misadventures in Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan in the last 30 or 40 years, the whole Philippines episode is taken on a new interpretation in history in terms of how America should be using its military power overseas. So you have those three losing episodes, but the big one is Reconstruction. George suffered from the dominance of the lost cause historiography of the 20th century, the white supremacist version of Confederate aims in the Civil War, and then leading into Jim Crow, the Dunning School from Columbia University. George was seen as a radical Republican who had tried to foist black rule on Southern whites up until the civil rights movement in the 1960s began to, overturn that narrative. But the vituperation and the disdain and the absolute hatred that people like George Boutwell suffered from the lost cause historians for much of the 20th century and from popular culture, such as Birth of a Nation and whatnot, that really all came together to give a very different interpretation of why the South went to war in the Civil War, and then, how they were abused and trampled on by the federal government during Reconstruction. So those are the four losing sides of major episodes that, George, I think, suffered by. And it's only been in the last 20 years, 30 years that new histories are coming out that are essentially rewriting all four of those episodes. You have Brenda Wineapple and David Stewart and Robert Levine with new histories of the Johnson impeachment. You have, of course, Ron Chernow and Ronald White and Charles Calhoun with new histories of the Grant administration. You have Stephen Kinzer and Stanley Carno writing new histories of the Philippine annexation and that period of history. And then, of course, biggest of all, Eric Foner and Reconstruction, and all of the historians who are giving a new gloss to Reconstruction in the last 20 or 30 years that overturns the lost cause historiography. And because of that, George is beginning to kind of emerge from the shadows. He's mentioned much more by people like Foner and Chernow and Charles Calhoun, Brenda Wineapple, and folks like that for the positive role he played in all four of those episodes. We'll go next. Quick background, political background. This will be a lead-in to his work with Abraham Lincoln. He was born in 1818 in Brookline, Mass. And for the golfers out there, for those who don't know, he was born in a farmhouse on a farm in Brookline, Massachusetts, that today is the clubhouse of the very exclusive the Country Club of Brookline, Massachusetts. And those who do play golf will know it's been the site of a famous Ryder Cup in 1999, numerous U.S. Open championships. I got a chance to go there 2 years ago, and I saw the foundation of the basement foundation of the farmhouse that was there when George was born. And right above it is this very, very posh clubhouse of the Country Club of Brookline, Mass. So for a guy who was born into a modest farming family and never made much money in his life, he managed to be born in a pretty good spot. George started off as actually joined the Temperance Party in the 1830s in his hometown of when he moved to Groton, Mass. Groton's about 15 miles west of Concord on the road out from Boston. Joined the Temperance Party first, but it was quickly obvious quickly that he wasn't going to win many elections in the Temperance Party. He became a Democrat because of his interest in labor and farm issues. As I said, served 7 terms in the Massachusetts House and then governor in the 1850s. His governorship was one of the seminal events in his political evolution or maturation. Of course, that was the time when the Whigs were imploding. The Democrats were splitting along northern and southern lines because of their stances on slavery. So George can no longer stomach being a Democrat because of the Democrats' position on slavery. And he, along with people like Henry Wilson and others, begins to look for a new home and finds it in the fledgling Republican Party of the middle 1850s. He was an important member of the Massachusetts Constitutional Convention in 1854, and even more so in the inaugural Massachusetts State Republican Convention in 1856. Now, he was recognized as one of the leaders of the Republican Party, but he took a bit of a hiatus for the next 4 years. He was invited to the 1856 Republican Convention that nominated John Fremont, and he was drafted as a candidate for Congress in 1858, but he turned both of those down because of his work as the Secretary of the Mass Board of Education, which he saw as very nonpartisan. He did not want to politicize that position, so he deferred any kind of deeper involvement in Republican Party politics until 1860. Next, please. Which is when he began to become acquainted with Abraham Lincoln. I've told a few of you, some of you know this, what I think is a great story about the April 1859 Jefferson birthday dinner, which was held at the Parker House Hotel in Boston. George was presiding over that dinner, and the invitations had been sent to the major, or who were thought to be the major candidates for the 1860 Republican nomination. Of course, Seward, Chase, Bates, and Lincoln. None of them could come. All 4 of them sent regrets, but Lincoln sent a very, very important letter of regrets in which he staked out his position on slavery, of not extending slavery to the Western territories. And the people at that dinner, who included Carl Schurz, who had come from Wisconsin and Missouri for the dinner, as well as Henry Wilson and others, Lincoln's letter made a profound impact on the folks at the Massachusetts Republican dinner in 1859 as things are heating up for the Republican National Convention. George went to that convention in 1860. He was one of the leaders of the Massachusetts delegation. He was asked to be one of 7 people serving on the drafting committee for the party platform. There was a resolutions committee of about 30 people, as Ed Acorn describes it, but that was too wieldy a number to actually draft the platform. So those 30 then picked 7. And George, along with Horace Greeley, Carl Schurz, Christoph Kerner, and a few others, was picked to actually draft the party platform. Well, Lincoln is nominated, and a delegation goes from Chicago down to Springfield. George is part of that delegation. He meets Abraham Lincoln for the first time in the parlor of Lincoln's home in May of 1860 after the convention. We then move ahead through the election. Lincoln is elected. George is making speeches this entire time about slavery being the cause of the coming rupture between North and South. He gave a very important speech in the shadow of Bunker Hill Monument in January of 1861 along those lines. But then he attended the Virginia Peace Conference at the Willard Hotel in February of 1861 and is one of the leaders of the Massachusetts-New York Northern Delegation who just will not compromise with any of the proposals put forth by the Virginia delegation, John Tyler and James Seddon, seeking to forestall war and get the North to back off. So he meets Lincoln at that peace conference. That's when Lincoln came into Washington incognito from Philadelphia and Baltimore. They meet together in the Willard Hotel, and that's another kind of way station on the developing relationship between Boutwell and Lincoln. War breaks out in April of 1861. Governor John Andrew of Massachusetts asks George to be the military liaison to the national government. He makes 3 trips between Massachusetts and Washington in April, May, June, and July, obviously in pretty dicey situation, especially in Maryland at that time. But he confers with Simon Cameron and Lincoln in Washington on the Massachusetts troops and war supplies that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts is supplying. July of 1861, he gives a very, to my mind, significant address at Harvard University, the Phi Beta Kappa, the same one that Ralph Waldo Emerson had given in 1837, and quite famous all the way through. George again talks about slavery as the cause of the conflict between North and South in July of 1861. So he's getting a reputation for, not pulling any punches when it comes to identifying slavery as the cause of the war. Emancipation is going to be the solution of the war. And yes, union is a wonderful war goal, but the war is all about slavery. It's not primarily about union. He continues to be a liaison between Massachusetts and the national government, but then Lincoln asks him to be on the Cairo War Commission, going out to the Western War Department in Cairo, Illinois, with Richard Henry Dana and Stephen Logan, Lincoln's law partner. So he's out there for about a month, but he's called back early because Lincoln appoints him to be the first commissioner of revenue in early of July 1862. Again, George's experience as governor of Massachusetts and other such jobs he'd had in the past. He was highly recommended by Salmon Chase, and he arrives back in Washington on July 16th, 1862. Next slide. You'll recognize these folks from the Lincoln Group. We had a lovely tour of IRS headquarters with Wendy and Susan back in October. But essentially, Commissioner Boutwell arrives back from Cairo, Illinois on July 16th. He begins his job with 3 staff members in the bottom floor of the Treasury building next to the Executive Mansion on July 17th. He's essentially making it up as he goes along. He's got to create a whole new bureau from start with very little guidance except what's in the Revenue Act of 1862. So the weeks following that, he's meeting constantly with Lincoln and Chase to appoint assessors, to appoint collectors, such that the staff grows from 3 in July of 1862 to over 3,000 by March of 1863. In addition, George implements a management system for dealing with all of the questions that are coming in from all over the northern states as to how do we apply the new taxes that we've been told to apply, not only on goods and services, but the new income tax, which was implemented for the first time in American history. So he's doing that, 7 days a week, almost 24 hours a day. It's just a monumental job, for which he gets a lot of credit from his colleagues. He does run for Congress in fall of 1862. There was a seat open, and he knows he won't have to take it until March of 1863, so he'll still be able to stay at the Revenue Bureau, which he does. But he did win that race for Congress, and he knows that he'll be joining the Congress in the spring of 1862. But George is such a workaholic and such attention to detail that final item, he leaves the Revenue Bureau in March of 1863. Chase actually asks him to stay on for another 6 months since Congress won't meet until August, and says, fine, you can do both jobs, no problem, no conflict of interest. And George says, no, there would be a conflict of interest. I really do have to resign from the Revenue Bureau, but tell you what I'll do. Of my own accord and totally gratis, I'll prepare a large tax manual for my successor to help them implement the taxes in the years ahead. And essentially that volume still exists, the tax manual of the United States, listing all of the tariffs, trade taxes, goods and services, income taxes, questions that come up as to what should be taxed and at what point in its production and all of that. George prepared that at the end of his tenure with the Internal Revenue Bureau. So we have George having arrived back in Washington in July. He's working furiously in the Revenue Department. But next slide, please. Lo and behold, he gets an invitation to come to the Great War meeting on August 6th, 1862. This is a public rally held on the east steps of the Capitol designed to whip up enthusiasm for the war. Similar rallies have been held in other cities across the North, but this will be the culmination of those rallies at a very, very dark time in Northern fortunes in the Civil War. McClellan is retreating from the Peninsula Campaign. He and Stanton are feuding about needed supplies and not getting enough troops. The Washington is filled with wounded and escaped enslaved people. August of 1862 is not a great time. Most importantly, you've got the Republican midterm or the midterm elections coming up, and Republican prospects are not that good. So George is asked to speak, be one of 10 speakers that day at this outdoor rally at the Capitol. Lincoln's going to attend. Chase and Bates also attend. And it's kind of instructive for me that George is listed as the second speaker. He's going to be speaking second. And he's the only one of all 10 speakers who emphasizes slavery as the cause of the war and not union as the goal. All of the others are saying, the war is all about union. It's all about maintaining the union, mentioning almost nothing at all about slavery. And George, just as he has been for several years, says, no, this war is all about slavery. Emancipation, for both military and moral reasons, is what's going to win the war. Next, please. And that's how it's reported in all of the newspapers that cover the event. You'll see at the bottom, ex-Governor Boutwell for absolute emancipation. You can go through 15, 20, 25 papers as I've done, and all the papers note right at the top of their articles, well, isn't this interesting? All the other speakers emphasize union, but George Boutwell is emphasizing slavery and emancipation as the solution for winning the war. Very, very positive press reaction. Also in Black American newspapers, even overseas, newspapers in London, Leeds, Liverpool, and elsewhere are commenting favorably on what Boutwell had to say about slavery as being the cause of the war. And at a time when the UK, when Britain, of course, was possibly contemplating recognizing the Confederacy, you needed the British public, which was against slavery, to offset the woolen manufacturers, the cotton manufacturers, and the landed elite in Britain who were more disposed to follow the Confederacy. So it was a positive element in preventing the UK from seriously considering recognizing the Confederate States of America. There were many other, probably more important reasons, but this helped. Next, please. So I'll kind of come to the conclusion here. Why was George invited to speak? He himself was amazed that he was. He says, look, he told the organizing committee, I'm going to talk about slavery. Do you want me to talk about slavery? And he fully expected to be disinvited from speaking, but they kept him on the roster, and he did. And I see this as kind of part and parcel of the continuum of what Lincoln was going through in the summer of 1862. All of you are totally familiar with this evolution, this timeline of how Lincoln got to announcing the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation on September 22nd. But no one has ever really talked about the influence of the Great War meeting as a reason as a way of gauging press and public reaction. I've written a fairly lengthy article for the coming issue of the Journal of the Abraham Lincoln Association, and there are a lot of quotes in there from Douglas Wilson and Harold Holzer and Burlingame and Gelso and others that I think reinforce the point that yes, you can see the Great War meeting as a means by which Lincoln kind of used George Boutwell as a surrogate to talk about slavery in an open meeting with 10,000 people as a way to gauge press and public reaction. And again, I can't go into great detail, but he had done the same thing with Carl Schurz 6 months previously in New York on the issue of compensated emancipation, where Lincoln definitely used Schurz as a stalking horse to say things that Lincoln himself couldn't say at a meeting at the Cooper Union. So I think the Great War meeting was pretty important. George Boutwell played a pretty important uh, role in that because of his speech at the Great War meeting. And we'll go to the final slide, where again I've foregrounded these a little bit. Douglas Wilson, the guiding star of Lincoln's philosophy was public sentiment is everything. You've got to get the public on your side. Holzer, the extraordinary focus on mastery of political journalism, the elaborate campaign to prepare the country for the Emancipation Proclamation. All of these, I think, fit into George's role at the Great War meeting in August of 1862. That's just one of the more salient incidents connecting Lincoln and Boutwell. There are others regarding the Revenue Commission and then the 13th Amendment and others, but that's the one I wanted to use as an example of how George has been underappreciated, I think, for a long time in terms of the role he played, certainly with Lincoln, but then also even more so with Ulysses Grant and other aspects of American politics. So I will end there.
Excellent talk, Jeffrey. Those of you who have questions, why don't you use the reaction thing here, raise your hand. But I'd like to use my prerogative to go first. So George Boutwell was Lincoln's revenue commissioner, and then he was Grant's Secretary of the Treasury. The income tax, of course, was a wartime measure during the Civil War. Did George think that in light of the great fortunes that were building up during the Gilded Age, did he think the income tax should remain as a permanent thing, or did he favor it going away?
Oh, absolutely wanted to maintain it. And given his Democratic background, it's not surprising George was in favor of a progressive income tax, which was the case in 1862. No tax up to the first $500, I think 5% up to 5,000, and then 10% above that. But George was very much in favor of a graduated income tax, progressive income tax, staying on the books. And a really interesting story there, of course, is that when it's first implemented in 1862, Salmon Chase is Secretary of the Treasury, George Boutwell is Commissioner of Internal Revenue. Chase becomes Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and the income tax is ruled unconstitutional by Chase's court during the Grant administration. Chase kind of did a 180 and said, well, it was only a wartime measure, it shouldn't stay on the books, and his court overruled and overturned the income tax. And who is the Secretary of Treasury at the time when he does that? George Boutwell. So they kind of meet again 8 or 9 years later on the subject of the income tax. The Chase verdict was soon overturned and the income tax came back in, but then it was also kind of deep sixed again in the 1880s, not to reappear until the 19 teens as we know it today. But George is very much in favor of a graduated income tax.
Okay. David Kent has a question, had his hand up first.
Yeah, I want to ask you about this dinner, the Jefferson dinner. You said that they sent invitations to Seward and to Bates and I think Chase and Lincoln. I just want to get a sense of from what your knowledge is of whether this was just a very wide range of people that they sent invitations to. And did they send the invitation did they include Lincoln in this because they were thinking of him as a possible presidential candidate? Or, because this is the meeting was April of 1859, so they would have been sending out letters earlier.
Yeah.
Or were they simply just sending one to him because he had just gotten a lot of press for the Lincoln Douglas debates and he was like a celebrity, whatever at the
Mhm.
time? What's your
Uh,
take on that?
yeah, I think it's the latter, David. I think it was just Lincoln was a prominent, Republican in the Midwest, had gained notoriety because of the Lincoln Douglas debates. I don't think necessarily because he was yet considered a presidential candidate. But it is instructive that, there were replies from Bates and um, Chase and Seward, in addition to Lincoln. And Lincoln's letter was the only one that kind of went into important substantive issues. The others said, "Oh, would love to be with you, but can't be there." But Lincoln really went into both the economic issues and the slavery issues that would define the presidential campaign the next year. But I think it was mainly just because he was a prominent Republican from the Middle West.
Okay, great, thank you.
John O'Brien was next.
Jeffrey, are you making the assertion that somehow Boutwell was a stalking horse in the Great War meeting of August 1862?
No, very much. Yeah.
Can you point to some evidence of your thought there?
Two main things. Well, one, uh, he was invited with the organizing committee, and I would think Lincoln, although I have no hard proof that Lincoln knew that at the time, but his views were well known, and they knew what he was going to speak about. He told them, "I'm going to speak about slavery. I'm not going to pull any punches." So they knew what they were getting when they invited him. I talked about the Carl Schurz episode of 6 months earlier when Lincoln had used Schurz as a stalking horse in a very similar situation in a speech at Cooper Union. There's also, there's an example of this with John Andrew in Massachusetts 9 months earlier, where John Andrew was invited to a meeting but said, "I can't go because I can't talk about emancipation. Let me send George Boutwell because he's not in office and he can deliver the message that I would have delivered anyway." So I think that all kind of together points to, there being a very good probability, although John, I can't swear it on a stack of Bibles, a very good probability that Lincoln knew what George was going to say and saw him as a stalking horse for emancipation.
There's no doubt that Lincoln used that as a strategy to put another speaker out in front on an issue to get the gauge reaction. I think that makes a lot of sense. I hadn't thought of it that way, but yeah, I agree with you.
Okay.
Matt Fink had a question or comment.
Yeah, I wonder with the 14th Amendment in the news all the time, was Boutwell very involved in the drafting? And just to pick today's topical issue, did he play any role in the birthright citizenship provision in the 14th Amendment?
Yeah. George was very involved in the drafting. He was a member both of the House Judiciary Committee and the Joint Committee on Reconstruction that came up with both the Civil Rights Bill and the 14th Amendment as they proceeded on parallel tracks in Congress in 1866. John Bingham is really recognized as the author of that first article on birthright citizenship and equality before the law. George was more writing about the keeping Confederates out of Congress, their disabilities of former Confederates serving in Congress. But he was part of the drafting committee, and he helped shepherd it through the both committee votes and then the full House vote.
Can I ask a going back question? What was it? Was his education in would it have a formal education in finance or law? No, just learned as he went along.
None of it. And that's why I think he's quite remarkable. George stopped going to school at the age of 12 or 13. He got a job in a dry goods store in Groton, Mass., and he learned the law with local lawyers, very much like Lincoln in that respect. He didn't go to college, didn't go to law school. He was totally self-educated, and he learned the law, at the feet of the local lawyers in Groton, Mass.
Thank you.
John Willen has a question.
Yeah, well, just a quick comment first that I'm sort of blown away by the depth of the experience with government and elsewhere that this guy had. Reminds me a little bit of George Bush, the first George Bush.
Mm-hmm.
But and some this was what made Lincoln come up with him to be basically the first IRS commissioner. Because as somebody just asked, did he have any background in finance? He hadn't written anything or was no expert on tax policy. Why
Oh,
did they
what?
come up with him?
Yeah, let me amend that, John. I mean, he served 7 terms in the Massachusetts House of Representatives. Part of that on the Banking Commission. He then was
Oh, okay.
governor for 2 years. He had that experience. George started writing articles for I forget the name of the magazine, a commercial review magazine in the 1840s. He was writing about English taxation and this, that, and the other thing. In some respects, George really was a polymath. He could absorb very different areas of intellectual, endeavor, and he was a quick study. So he might not have had any formal education in finance, but he had a lot of practical education.
Now you said he liked to stay in the background. Was there ever anybody who considered maybe trying to get him to run for president?
Closest he ever came was at the 1880 convention, where, of course, Ulysses Grant, tried for the nomination in 1880. George was one of Grant's convention managers, along with Roscoe Conkling. And when Grant was, he and Blaine kind of shot each other out, and James Garfield stepped forward to win on the 35th ballot. When Garfield was nominated, as a sop to Grant, they said, okay, we'll take take a Grant man for vice president. They ended up taking Chester Arthur, but George was considered as a vice presidential candidate for Garfield, which, of course, if that had happened,
Been president.
George would have become president when Garfield was assassinated. Now, it wasn't that close. I mean, Chester Arthur represented New York, had a lot more electoral votes in Massachusetts, but his name was mentioned as a possible VP candidate in 1880.
Janet Saros has a question, has her hand up.
Thanks very much for your talk, Jeff. I enjoyed it and I look forward to reading your book. I have a question regarding whether or not you came across any personal reflections that George may have had about Lincoln and his personal relationship with him. Obviously, they had a working relationship, but I'd be curious as to whether he put down any of his thoughts regarding Lincoln.
Mm-hmm. Good question. One of the joys of doing this book was that all of George's papers are contained up in Groton, Mass, with the Groton Historical Society, which runs the Governor Boutwell House. When George's daughter Georgiana died in 1933, she left the house, a very nice kind of Italianate house on Main Street, to the Groton Historical Society, which is why it's stayed, pristine all those years. And all of George's papers are there, but no one's ever looked at them. There was a modest biography written in the 1980s by a PhD candidate, but no one has ever gone through George's papers. So it was kind of virgin territory to go through them. That being said, there were wonderful letters from George to his family where he puts down his impressions of Lincoln and Grant and whatnot. He never kept a diary, and that's one of my big regrets, unlike Hamilton Fish or Salmon Chase or others who kept detailed diaries. He didn't keep a diary, so you don't get those really kind of ruminations of writing at 11 o'clock at night at the end of the day and putting down his innermost personal thoughts. But it's a whole treasure trove of letters from George to his wife, to his daughter, who was his most important political helpmeet in Washington, Georgiana. And I think people who read the book are going to get a wonderful respect for George's daughter. She was a formidable person in her own right in Washington society and Washington politics, and a very good friend to Ulysses Grant.
Jeff, to kind of follow on that about Boutwell and the Lincolns, George Boutwell was one of the few people that Mary Lincoln seemed to approve of. Tell the story about George Boutwell and Mary's bid to get a pension.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure Mary approved of George so much as she was just looking for any, life saver she could find. But she did indeed write to George in 1869 when he's still in Congress. Shortly before he went into the Grant administration, he gets a letter from Mary Lincoln, postmarked from the Hotel Angleterre in Frankfurt, Germany. Mary is hoping that Congress will award a pension, a widow's pension, to her for her husband's wartime service, which resulted in his death. Charles Sumner was taking care of that legislation in the Senate. She wrote to George so that he would take care of it or take the lead on it in the House. And she wrote a very moving letter to George about, a dear friend of my husband's who I hope will now help his widow in her time of need.
And she didn't get the full amount she was seeking, right? The
No,
Congress cut it.
they were so sick and tired of Mary Lincoln, I think, that they dithered and dallied, and they finally, several years later, awarded her a smaller pension, but not what she was looking for.
Okay. Anybody else have a question or comment? Okay.
Oh, and I have a quick question. It's more about
Sure.
the Boutwell, I guess, family lore. Are
Mhm.
you, Jeffrey, are you the most interested in like the Boutwell family history, or is this like a family pastime that you all contribute to?
Oh, I'm the only one interested.
Oh dear. Okay. I
It's
get that.
it's it's one of the mysteries of my life that I grew up in the Boston area. My dad was politically aware and politically interested. Other family members were too. And here was this illustrious relative, governor of Massachusetts, congressman, senator, Grant, Lincoln, and everything. And just no one ever mentioned him while I was growing up. And I had to learn about him by myself when I got to my 30s and 40s and 50s. Uh,
Wow.
so no, it's definitely not a family endeavor.
Wow.
But
That's unfortunate.
it's becoming one now as
Yeah,
they
I'm
learn more
sure.
about it.
Well, now that you've done all the legwork,
Yeah,
now everybody can just follow in your
yeah.
footsteps. So that's great.
It's one of the great lines from the show Hamilton. Who's going to tell your story?
Hmm.
If nobody gets into this, we lose an important context in history. Yeah, you're writing this book about your relative, I think, serves a very important purpose that others will benefit from. And I thank you for doing it.
I thank you. Thanks, John. And I think so too. I think other historians will now come along in the future and build on this. And I will say, just a kind of a personal aspect of it, following up on Kelsey's question. For a long time, I was kind of self deterred from writing about George because, all the interest that people have in genealogy and whatnot. I didn't want to be seen as, oh, well, isn't that nice? He's writing about a family member from 100 years ago. That's nice. That's sweet. And I thought, if there isn't really something there that deserves writing about, I don't want to be seen as puffing up a relative just for the sake of puffing up a relative. The more I found out, obviously, the more I thought there is a lot there that deserves to be unveiled and written about. And so that's how it kind of evolved.
Hey, Jeff, in your research, did you find anything about the original guy, James Boutwell, the indentured servant? Whatever happened to him?
I have a
From
pretty good family
Salem?
tree coming down from him. I don't know that much more about him. Would like to at some point, but essentially, he fathered a bunch of farming families in New England. My family was in New Hampshire, farmers in the 1800s. George's was in Massachusetts, living not that far away, but it was New England Boutwells kind of in the farming uh, milieu. But I will tell you a really interesting thing that I want to run down at some point, and has to do with genealogy, and it's going to take a lot of work. I've connected to a lot of Boutwells all over the country, and there are a lot of them, thousands. And what I found is that there are two distinct lines. There's a northern Boutwell line and a southern Boutwell line, and they may be totally independent. They may not even be genetically related. I was told that the Boutwells that came out of Virginia in the 1700s were actually a different family that took the Boutwell name, but they're not, genetically related to us. Be that as it may, uh, chills ran down my spine when I learned about a year ago For those who remember the hot Birmingham summer of 1963, and Sheriff Bull Connor and Martin Luther King and this famous letter from Birmingham jail and all of that, do you know who the mayor of Birmingham, Alabama was at the time?
Oh, well.
Albert Boutwell. Now, whether he's related, I'm not sure, but Albert Boutwell was the mayor when Bull Connor was the head of the public security in Birmingham and was letting loose fire hoses and attack dogs on black protesters in Birmingham in 1863. I've been to Birmingham to kind of look into that a little bit. There's a big Boutwell Auditorium in Birmingham, and it just is quite remarkable to think of having a relative like George, who was so instrumental in civil rights legislation in the 1860s and 70s, and then think of an Albert Boutwell 90 years later in Birmingham, Alabama.
You don't want to
Debbie,
be related to that guy.
Debbie Jackson and Bill Lammers have their hands up.
Hi. Yeah, just kind of, it's quite amazing. Sometimes you discover and find things you don't even know you're looking for. It just kind of comes up. This anti-imperialism just struck me as we're in an age when we're talking about renaming the Gulf of America for this water mess.
Mm-hmm.
Any further correlations to what's going on now that you have seen that's kind of started then? As you remember from the book discussion, we saw that how so much is deeply rooted back then that's coming up, that keeps percolating up, and it's just almost frothy now. So what are your comments that you can add to what you picked up from your research from Boutwell?
Essentially, Debbie, on the anti-imperialism, just that he thought we could gain all the benefits we wanted from our involvement with the world through trade and diplomacy, and that we didn't need to be sending troops or American boys to foreign shores to physically occupy, places like the Philippines, which then lead to conflict with the local populations, and essentially nobody wins. So he was not an isolationist in any way, shape, or form. He was an advocate as Secretary of the Treasury for a very strong merchant marine. He wanted to, compete with British ships in international trade, and he wanted a strong national defense, but for the, protection of America and not for foreign adventures.
And you said that Frederick Douglass and others and Booker T, they were all a part of this as well.
It's a fascinating part of American history. A lot of people had very different reasons for joining the anti-imperialist campaign. People like Andrew Carnegie were doing it out of economics. They said, this is a total waste of money. If you took all the money we spent in the Philippines and built up American infrastructure, you'd do a hell of a lot more for our, economic well-being. Washington and Du Bois did it because of, the racial overtones of going to the Philippines and fighting, Asian peoples. Not surprisingly, maybe, the Spanish-American War was a great unifier between the North and the South. With Southern and Northern troops fighting together overseas, it really helped the reconciliation process between North and South, and TR capitalized on that, saying this is a wonderful way for North and South to come back together to fight a common enemy. Well, George didn't consider the Filipino people an enemy.
Wasn't Mark Twain, a member as well?
Oh, Mark Twain, he had some wonderful scathing articles about imperialism and booty and the Philippines and whatnot. No, Twain was in many ways the symbol and the figurehead of the movement for a couple of very important years.
He famously had the American flag be black and white stripes with, I think, skull and crossbones or something instead of stars. He was very anti imperialism.
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else have any questions? Okay, well, I'd like to thank Jeffrey for an excellent presentation. Thank all of you for great questions and comments.